Midnight in the Green Valley residency was absolute. The silence was heavy, thick enough to muffle the distant hum of the city. Then, the scream tore through the air. It was sharp, jagged, and originated from the fourth floor. It hit the hallway walls and bounced, turning into a frantic, high-pitched plea for help. "Is anyone there?" The voice faded into a ragged gasp. Doors slammed open. Footsteps thundered against the concrete floor as residents surged toward the stairwell, pushing past one another in a panic. They converged on flat 407, chests heaving, eyes searching for the source of the noise. The hallway was empty. Dust motes danced in the dim light of the emergency lamps. The door to 407 was dead by the metal cold and unyielding. The building manager pushed to the front, his keys rattling in his trembling hand. He pointed at the door, his voice barely a whisper. The flat had been sealed for 2 years, ever since Professor Raghav Mehra vanished. The residents stared at the wood, the sudden realization settling in that the plea for help had come from a tomb. The panic eventually receded, leaving the fourth floor to the suffocating stillness once more. Neighbors retreated behind their own locked doors, leaving the long vacant flat 407 to brood in the dark. Across the courtyard, 16-year-old Aryan stood on his balcony, his gaze fixed on the shadowed windows of the unit. He knew the history. He knew the power lines to that flat had been severed months ago by the building management. The apartment should have been a void, a black hole in the structure of the residency. He leaned over the railing, his knuckles white against the cold iron. He waited for nothing, expecting only the familiar sight of empty glass. Then, a spark, a low, rhythmic flicker, pulsed from deep within the living room. It was not a reflection of the street lamps below. It was a genuine, internal source of light. Aryan narrowed his eyes, his breath hitching in his chest. The light didn't just appear. It moved, casting long, erratic streaks against the interior walls. It was impossible, a direct violation of the building's current state. Yet the glow persisted, steady and deliberate, defying the reality of a vacant, powerless home. Aryan fumbled for his phone, his thumb trembling as he hit the record button. Through the small screen, the image was grainy, yet undeniable. A tall, distorted silhouette paced behind the glass of flat 407. It moved with a jagged, repetitive gait, back and forth, back and forth. The shadow stopped, turned toward the window, and then simply evaporated into the darkness of the room. Aryan stood frozen, the phone still held high, heart hammering against his ribs. He replayed the clip 3 times. The pixels shifted, but the evidence remained. By the next morning, the residency was a hive of frantic whispers. The incident had escaped the 4th floor, seeping into the lobby and the common areas. Residents spoke of wailing in the vents and cold spots that turned their breath to mist. The 4th floor, once a simple corridor of doors, was now treated as a forbidden zone. People took the stairs to avoid passing the lift, and the hallway outside 407 remained perpetually deserted. Nobody dared to look, let alone investigate. The building had collectively decided that the truth was something best left behind a locked door, leaving Aryan alone with the recording on his device. The rumors did not satisfy Aryan. While the rest of the building retreated into superstition, he felt only a cold, growing irritation at the unsolved mystery. He knew that ghosts did not leave shadows that paced, and ghosts certainly did not need to hunt. He waited until the residency fell into its deepest, most silent hour at midnight. He took a small, high-definition camera from his desk, checked the battery, and slipped into the corridor. The 4th floor was deathly quiet. Every footfall felt like a drumbeat against the linoleum. He reached the door of flat 407, his palms slick with sweat. He did not try the handle. He knew it was locked. Instead, he scanned the hallway for a blind spot. He found a recess near a fire extinguisher, perfectly positioned to capture anyone entering or exiting the unit. He knelt, mounting the device with steady, practiced movements, ensuring the lens was angled precisely toward the door frame. He pressed the record button, the tiny red light blinking once, before he covered it with a piece of dark tape. With the trap set, he retreated to his own balcony, staring into the dark, waiting for the technology to prove what his eyes had already seen. At 2:13 a.m., the motion sensor triggered the recording. Aryan watched from his balcony as the screen flickered to life. The door to flat 407, which had remained firmly shut for years, creaked open just wide enough for a shadow to slip through. A figure clad in black, moving with frantic precision, stepped into the dim hallway. It did not look back. It sprinted toward the stairwell door, the movement blurred by the low light. Before disappearing into the metal frame, Aryan did not wait. He scrambled from his room, his breath hitching as he sprinted down the corridor. He reached the stairwell door and shoved it open, expecting to see the intruder descending the steps. He listened for the slap of shoes against concrete or the metallic clang of a door closing. Nothing. The stairwell was completely silent, bathed in the stagnant, dusty air of a building that had gone to sleep. He looked up, then down, peering over the railings into the yawning abyss of the shaft. Not a soul. The figure had vanished as if it were part of the architecture itself, leaving Aryan standing in the hollow silence, staring at an empty path that led to nowhere. The impossible disappearance left Aryan reeling. He retreated to his room, his mind racing through every angle, every shadow he had seen on the screen. He needed something tangible, something that existed outside the reach of the intruder.
He remembered the reports of Professor Raghav Mehra, the man who had simply vanished.
Aryan spent the next few hours tearing through old, archived property records and estate filings he had scraped from local digital caches. He moved from his desk to the floor, spreading out yellowed papers and handwritten notes. His fingers brushed against a thick, leather-bound book tucked into a gap beneath his own bookshelf, a remnant of the professor's belongings that had been discarded by the building management years ago. A dry crackle, pages turned, scribbles met. Pressed ink at the very back. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, and desperate. It read, "If anything happens to me, look for the truth behind the wall." Aryan stared at the words, the ink still sharp against the brittle paper. He looked toward the wall of his own room, then back at the floor plan of 407. The mystery was no longer a ghost story. It was a physical trap waiting to be dismantled. Aryan stood in the hallway with two officers, the weight of the diary pressing against his palm.
The door to flat 407 groaned as the police crowbar bit into the frame. With a sharp crack of splintering wood, the lock gave way,
and the door swung inward. Stale, trapped air rushed out, carrying the scent of dust and long-forgotten paper. They stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, illuminating thick cobwebs draped over heavy, abandoned furniture. Aryan moved toward the far wall, guided by the urgency of the diary's final note.
He traced his fingers along the surface, feeling for the anomaly.
He found it near the corner, a hairline fracture in the plaster that seemed to vibrate under his touch. He pressed his knuckles against it, and the sound was hollow, revealing a void behind the masonry. One of the officers stepped up,
striking the wall with the butt of a heavy flashlight. The plaster shattered in a cloud of white dust, revealing a jagged opening.
As the debris cleared, they stepped into the hidden room. It was not a storage space. The walls were lined with monitors, wires snaking across the floor like tangled roots, and banks of recording equipment humming with a low, electric whine. The truth was not a ghost. It was a cold, calculated operation hidden in the dark.
The hum of the monitors filled the cramped space, masking the sound of breathing until it was too late.
Aryan stepped deeper into the room, his flashlight sweeping across stacks of files labeled with apartment numbers.
A sudden movement in the shadows behind a server rack forced him to spin around. A figure lunged, pushing past the officers toward the exit, but the narrow doorway caught him. The man stumbled,
slamming against the doorframe as the officers pinned him to the floor. Aryan held his light steady, illuminating the face of the man beneath the dark hood. It was Rogov's nephew. The man snarled, his eyes darting toward a satchel stuffed with legal documents and property deeds dropped on the floor. He had been living in the crawl space, manipulating the lights and speakers to drive neighbors away from the floor. He wanted the residency deeds, and he had turned the empty flat into a command center for his harassment campaign. The greed in his expression was stark, a sharp contrast to the imagined terror that had gripped the building for months. He stopped fighting, his chest heaving as the handcuffs clicked shut. The ghost was gone, replaced by the mundane, ugly reality of family betrayal and cold, calculated theft.
The officers dragged the nephew out of the flat, his protests echoing down the stairwell until the heavy exterior door slammed shut.
Aryan lingered, his gaze fixed on the empty chair where the man had sat. The police took the lead, driving to the outskirts of the city where the nursing facility stood, a gray monolith behind high iron gates. They found Professor Rogov in a shared ward, his bed positioned against a window overlooking a barren courtyard. He did not look up when the door opened. He did not flinch when the officers spoke his name. Aryan stood in the doorway, observing the thin, frail man staring into the distance. The professor's hands rested motionless on his lap, knuckles white and trembling.
When the officers explained that the flat was safe, that his nephew was in custody,
The old man only turned his head slightly. His eyes remained hollow, reflecting a deep, permanent withdrawal. He did not ask about his neighbors. He did not express relief. He simply looked away, his silence heavier than any scream. Every word the police offered felt like a pebble dropped into a bottomless well. He had been forgotten, and in that quiet, sterile room, he had decided to stay that way. The fourth-floor corridor felt different now. The air was still, stripped of the phantom screams and flickering shadows that had defined it for months. Residents stood in the hallway, clustered near the open door of flat 407. They leaned forward, eyes scanning the room, expecting to see the remnants of a haunting. Instead, they saw only dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun and the bare, neglected walls. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy,
pressing against their chests. Aryan watched them from the doorway.
He saw the shift in their posture, the way they avoided looking at one another, the way they shifted their weight, suddenly hyper-aware of the space they had ignored for 2 years. There was no ghost to blame for the professor's absence. There was only the memory of a man they had seen every day, a man whose disappearance they had simply accepted as a new reality. They had been terrified of a phantom, while the real tragedy sat in a sterile room miles away, abandoned by the very people who now stood here, searching for a culprit. The realization settled over the group.
Thick and suffocating. The terror they had feared was never behind the door. It was in the hallways,
in the locked rooms, and in the quiet, collective choice to look away when a neighbor needed them most.